Hello, dear listeners. My name is Zheltikova, Inga, Vladislavovna. I am a lecturer at the Oryol State University. I am dealing with the problems of future research in the field of future studies, and today I offer you a conversation about the future of society and the options that this future may acquire. So, what will the society of the future be like? Is it possible to foresee it, and, if possible, how? To begin with, I would like to focus on a question that is important for any forecasting, but for forecasting complex in the field of the social sphere. Forecasting the social sphere is the most relevant. This is a problem of the possibility or impossibility of those difficulties that await a researcher who wants to offer his own versions of forecasts in the field of society, of the processes taking place in society. We can focus on the three most important factors that do not allow us to make successful predictions in the social sphere. And these factors include the first one, the multi-components of society, and, accordingly, the multiplicity of indicators that can changing existing trends. This is exactly what the author of the famous concept of the black swan asymptotic says, who points out that social reality is represented by events of very different scales, and the types of interaction between these events are also extremely different. It can be extremely difficult to isolate from this sea of facts those trends that will objectively affect a future event, since at the time of forecasting these leading trends are objectively absent. When we look back, we easily identify those parameters that influenced our present. But while we are looking into the future, it is extremely difficult to identify the parameters of the present that will have an impact on the future. The second indicator that makes social forecasting difficult is the openness of the social system and the inability to build a clear sequence between the past, present and future, as we do in the field of closed systems, for example, nature. Karl Popper speaks about this, pointing out that social reality is constantly changing and developing in a non-repetitive way. Unlike the change of seasons or the stage of development of a butterfly, processes in society are unique. And this uniqueness does not allow us to see from today what tomorrow's day will be, relying only on previous trends. And the third factor, in short, is the subjectivity of assessments of the leading trends of the present. The fact is that it is the researcher who sees in certain events of the present those factors that will influence the future. Whether they will influence the future, we will really know only when this future takes place. Richard Slaughter notes that the forecast is usually determined by factors of the present, which may change or be irrelevant in the future. As a result, it primarily leads to false ideas about the future. These are the factors of the present, which seem to us extremely important today. Tomorrow they may not look like that anymore. Why am I bringing up this topic at the very beginning of our conversation? Not in order to show its meaninglessness, but in order to note the difficulty that every researcher faces who wants to reflect on the future of society. I think that a correct assessment of the task that we are addressing allows us to set priorities correctly. What we want to achieve with our forecast, to see the future as it will become, to see the opportunities that lurk in this future, or to notice those trends that may pose a danger that we would like to avoid. I think it is necessary to start our conversation by repeating that the social forecast concerns the functioning of society, which is a multi-component system. At these three spheres of society's life, economic, political, social and spiritual, are the factors of social transformations that occur and that can influence these transformations. By economics we mean, first of all, the production, distribution and consumption of material goods, without which no society can function. It is the economic sphere of society that sets the basic objective parameters of society, the foundation that we cannot abandon simply because a person, as he exists now, requires satisfaction of a number of needs, which are primarily aimed at economic activity. By the political sphere of society, we understand first of all the institutions of power, the resources of power, the principles of the functioning of power, which generally determines the current state of society. Its formal parameters are those mechanisms that ensure the life of society, which normalize this life and set certain limits for it. Social relations are a large sphere of society's life, which includes types of social interactions, types of social mutual assistance, as well as all those forms by which a person reproduces his existence as a human existence, not biological, but human. Social relations translate the features of human interaction with social groups and, accordingly, determine the person himself and the type of these social groups. The spiritual sphere of society is art, science, ethics, religion and all those actions and their results that a person commits due to his spiritual needs. The spiritual sphere is a relatively autonomous area that reflects the specifics of people's lives in time and space, regional temporal national specifics. Within the framework of these four spheres of society, there are at least three more parameters that influence the processes in the present that can transform our future. First, it is human nature and the possibilities of changing it in general. The problem of changing human nature at the level of philosophical understanding of society was posed relatively recently, at the beginning of the 21st century. The point here is that the society that we imagine, the types of state, legal, and cultural relations that surround us, are largely set by the basic parameters of humanity, which is not so easy to define, but a change in which can lead to a change in society in general. The American philosopher Francis Fukuyama reflects on this in his work Our Post-Human Future. Fukuyama notes that the existing system of legislation of international relations law in most of its countries proceeds from the immutability of human nature, from the fact that we are all human beings. We are all people experiencing pain, capable of empathy. We possess not only rationality, but the emotional sphere, and we are mortal. A change in human nature, for example, the loss of the unity of the human race, will lead to the loss of those systems of relationships that we know. Another factor influencing the state of society is ecology. And on the scale of an ecosystem, society is one of its constituent parts. Changes in the relations in the human nature system can lead to a change in the format of society and all four of its spheres. The society that we know has developed in a situation of almost uncontrolled and limited use of natural resources. Changing this situation will lead to a change in the whole society, a reformatting of society. And finally, we should not forget about the so-called X factor, an unknown moment that may happen in the future, which we cannot now assume. This is something from the category, for example, the arrival of aliens who are friendly or unfriendly towards Earthlings, which will lead to such changes in society that we cannot fundamentally imagine now. Let's focus on each of the spheres of society's life and see what trends exist in this area now. After we discuss this, we will look at how the combination of these trends, the arrangement of these trends, is able to give one or another kind of future as one of the options. So, when we talk about economics, we can identify several basic areas that determine the essence of economic trends. Firstly, these are resources. Secondly, these are technologies, forms of ownership. This is the scale of the economy, and in modern times, this is participation in the economic processes of the digital sphere. Speaking about resources, we see that the main changes in this area are related to the transition of the use of energy resources from non-renewable ones, such as oil, gas, wood, coal, fish to renewable resources. First of all, this is solar and wind energy. These are artificially created nutrients that allow us to make modern technologies. The second point related to resources is the orientation of society to the minimum satisfaction of needs or to the maximum satisfaction of needs. In the last 100 years, most of humanity has been living in a situation of a consumer society, that is, a consumption that is designed for its own renewal and the formation of production of new needs, those that a person may not experience. Here, the reorientation of society from a consumption-oriented attitude to reasonable consumption or restriction of consumption is one of the possible trends of the future. Another parameter that can significantly change economic relations is the extraction of minerals outside the terrestrial environment. We are talking about the development of space resources, asteroids, and nearby planets. Well, another point that is important here for the future is the possible redistribution of existing land resources on a principle other than national ownership. If we now have states and borders within which natural resources are located, then we can imagine that in the future this order will be changed. Speaking of technologies, we mean the trend of digitalization of the economy, starting from the participation of digital technologies in production processes, ending with the elimination of production processes from human participation by the full automation of these processes. One of the trends of recent years is the so-called green economy. This is the orientation of energy consumption primarily, but not only, on environmental conservation, the creation and use of special technologies that are designed to minimize energy consumption. We can attribute to technology a rather old trend of social studies, that is, the use of labor resources with a high level of intellectual and professional training. And these are two more trends related to each other. Firstly, labor mobility, the possibility of workers moving from one country, from one region, from one part of the world to another, and this is the episodicity of work, which allows a person not to work for 8 hours for several working days. The fact that a person decides for himself when to work, to what extent to work and where to work. Speaking about forms of ownership, we have here, on the one hand, traditional forms of private property, on the other hand, the emergence of completely new forms of ownership, such as digital property, trends such as globalization and nationalization of property within the framework of all, let's say, humanity. In general, we can talk about mutually contradictory trends in the economy. This is a trend of globalization and regionalization of the economy. On the one hand, this is a tendency towards unification, on the other hand, towards the separation of economic systems. But besides this, we can observe the emergence of the anarchic principle, or the cellular principle of the organization of economic relations, which assumes the absence of a single center of this organization. And again, the opposite trend is for multinational corporations, which, on the contrary, seek to centralize and control most processes. Digitalization of economic processes, on the one hand, leads to so-called smart production or dark factories. These are huge production arrays that completely exclude human participation except for the participation of control, which is carried out by one or more people, and on the other hand, this is an increase in the share of manual labor, including in the production of consumer goods, which, on the one hand, it allows you to occupy labor resources, and on the other hand, it gives a person the opportunity to get exclusive things. The next area is the sphere of politics. It can detect the following trends that are important for the future. Firstly, these are the changes that are taking place in the form of power. On the one hand, this is a trend towards open political processes, towards more and more conscious participation of people in political decision-making. On the other hand, it is the closure of political processes, it is the control of information by the authorities and the use of such methods by the authorities that are invisible to the governed. Therefore, the tendency to liberalize self-organization in politics, an increase in the share of civil society, is adjacent to an increase in state control, the desire of the system to attack the world of life, as representatives of the Frankfurt School say. As for the ways and resources of the power of innovation in these areas, then, of course, it is worth recalling new methods of indirect management, not directly influencing people, but influencing people through the film industry, through leading bloggers, those representatives, as if not the authorities, whom the population trusts. This control of information flows is also a very interesting trend. It can be represented, on the one hand, by the fact that some information is controlled. Its appearance in the public domain is very tightly controlled, and it really does not appear. On the other hand, this manipulation by increasing information flows, that is, a huge amount of information that a person is not able to process and digest, has the same effect of controlling information. And another topic that is very important in politics, which has an impact on society, is, of course, interethnic interactions. These are conflicts or cooperation. These are forms of open or closed conflicts. These are certain forms of cooperation at the state level or at the level of their individual representatives. Social relations, of course, is the biggest area that interests us, and we can only mention some of its moments here. First, speaking about the social structure, we must note the possibility of its vertical or horizontal construction. A social hierarchy that can be implemented according to completely different principles in the future. For example, a genetic hierarchy depending on the modification and level of modification of a person, a technocratic hierarchy depending on the usefulness, level of knowledge, level of awareness of a person, or the rejection of hierarchy and equality of opportunities, equality of basic resources, equality of self-realization, the principle of formation of social groups. The fact is that this is exactly the moment that has obviously been changing in the last literally decades, and the trend here is towards desocialization, that is, that a person really needs other people less and less, and therefore social ties are collapsing. Real social connections. So here we see a virtual community with such a tendency as a plurality of personality. On the one hand, the individual personality is real. A physical subject can be represented by different personalities in different environments, primarily digital environments, but not only. This is, on the contrary, a personality that consists of several specific individuals. And again, we are talking here primarily about digital personalities. This is the principle of randomness in the formation of social connections. This is a variant of the controlled chaos that we have in society. Another point that characterizes this process is the degree of human involvement in society. Here in the West we see such very active conversations about the personality of monady. A monad is a nomad. And modern man, especially in the Western industrialized developed society, feels free from any restrictions. He can travel freely, he can work wherever and as long as he wants. He is able to identify himself with different social groups, different genders, perform various functions within the family and fundamentally does not want to identify himself with any social function of the role of gender. A very interesting topic is the topic of family, which will obviously undergo a transformation in the future, and different forms of family will appear. One of the leading trends is the emergence of family forms depending on the performance of various functions, which are now identified with one family. This is a function of socialization, mutual support, reproductive function, leisure function, which can be divided into different families. And, for example, young people who came from the family where they were born and raised. Let's say they can form temporary youth families, for example, in students, the main function of which is mutual communication, leisure emotional support. Then more mature people form a family to carry out their reproductive function, to have offspring, to grow into children. However, after the children have grown up and left the family will often break up, because to a large extent it was the children who connected mom and dad. Now they are free individuals who are again creating new relationships, the purpose of which will be the emergence of deeper, let's say, emotional connections. Well, one of the options. The system of upbringing and education is also a social topic. Here we are talking about regular or continuing education, about education within the family, the state, self-education, fragmentation of education, when a person learned a little something and somehow. These are the trends that we have now. Finally, there is a very interesting topic of social protection and support, which are present in any society, and new trends here may be, firstly, an obvious trend of integration of people who require social assistance and social protection. This protection, in particular, concerns the ways of integrating them into society. On the other hand, this is the opposite trend of reservation, exclusion of people, creation of special territories, safe territories for these people. Uniting people who require social support into groups that will support them, expanding these groups, including one of the options for social protection of the future, which comes from the distant past, is the principle of exclusion. For example, encouraged euthanasia for elderly or terminally ill people. For example, this is the exclusion of certain individuals from society. For example, according to vital signs at the time of the birth of a child. Next, we have the spiritual sphere, which also has a number of parameters that are very important for forming a comprehensive understanding of the possibilities of the future. First of all, it is, of course, information and ways to distribute it, ways to interact with it. Here we see two opposite trends. On the one hand, this is a continuing increase in the volume of information, the quality of information, the availability of information, and the depth of information. On the other hand, this is, of course, another trend. This is a restriction of distribution, which, on the one hand, is associated with natural boundaries in the possibility of consuming information and the possibility of restricting information by some structures, for example, political ones. Science, obviously, has two opposite trends of the future. This is differentiation, that is, a greater deepening and separation of sciences, and the integration of scientific knowledge, unification, creation of related fields and a comprehensive view of the reality around us. We can also refer to science as the literally explosive growth of artificial intelligence. As for the sphere of art, the obvious new processes here are hybrid processes. This is the connection of man, human creativity, artificial intelligence creativity, digital technologies, the creation of digital art objects, that is, physically digital objects. In religion, such trends of the future may possibly be neopaganism, a new orthodox religion, or, conversely, secularization. As for ethics, the processes of pluralism of ethical attitudes are obvious, but theoretically it can be assumed that the pendulum will swing in the other direction and some new ethical doctrine will replace pluralism, which will be mandatory. As for changing human nature, this is a separate topic here, but we are only interested in it as far as it is related to society. How can a change in human nature have an impact on society? First, there is the theme of evolution and involution. We are improving, or we are getting worse, and what we consider to be an improvement or a deterioration. Is there a change in human nature in the direction of its specialization, the strengthening of certain capabilities, or is a change going towards the affirmation of the harmony of those qualities that a person has now? What is considered evolution? What is considered involution? Genetic engineering, the possibility of creating programmed human qualities and what this leads to, is just this idea of Futurama. When people plus people with additional abilities appear, automatically all people who will be in the basic configuration will be minus people, that is, people who will lose to improved people. This is the problem of a cyborg, a man with artificial parts, who is created in order to correct some human flaws or, conversely, in order to give a person new opportunities. This is an artificial human android, which is not originally a human, but an artificial being with intellectual and other parameters close to a human. This is the problem of immortality, starting from life extension, including nanotechnology to control human health, which will also theoretically prolong life for a very long time, including the idea of digital immortality, that is, rewriting human consciousness on non-biological media. This is such a trend as getting rid of pain in various ways that allow us to give up this moment, which is very uncomfortable for a person. But at the same time, getting rid of pain will also mean getting rid of compassion, because compassion, empathy have a part, that is, we have compassion because we understand what pain is. And getting rid of pain may make us insensitive. And, of course, these are alternative ways of reproduction through the creation of artificial organs, which would be artificial machines that could replace the human body for carrying a child. That is, it is also quite an obvious and uncomplicated trend, a fairly likely trend. As for the environment, well, there are three important points here. Firstly, the possibility of solving environmental problems by limiting or the possibility of solving environmental problems by accelerating the development of science and solving them with the help of science. This is a problem of the biosphere and the noosphere, their mutual influence. And another point that I attributed to ecology here is space as a resource. And, of course, the X factor is something that we cannot assume right now. Therefore, it is pointless to talk about this in principle, because if we cannot assume this, then any assumption is no longer a factor X as such. We can talk about a space disaster, the arrival of aliens, the appearance of some kind of scientist villain. But all this is no longer the X factor, because we can call it something absolutely indefinite. And what was the point of this whole conversation? He meant that in order to answer the question of what the society of the future will be like, we must take into account the diversity of all these factors that I have just mentioned. Here in this picture, most of the factors that I mentioned are listed, and the connections that can be established between them. And it is clear that it is possible to imagine the results of this interaction only as one scenario. I can offer you this scenario approach, when we choose several from a variety of options and as a result calculate and model the resulting social reality. So, if we take with you these trends from the listed ones that I mentioned in the field of each of the spheres of life. So, in the economy, we take the situation of a shortage of energy resources and their monopolization. At the same time, it is the introduction of a digital economy, a green economy. In politics, we assume increased control and indirect management methods. In social relations, the trends that have been named are randomly taken. This is equality of basic resources, different forms of family, reservation of socially supported in the spiritual sphere on the one hand. This is theologization. These are objects of digital and integration of scientific knowledge, and let's add a little change in human nature. This is involution, digital immortality, an alternative way of reproduction. Which scenario do we get in this case? So, we have the appearance of a socially democratic society with a high level of self-government. A variety of social groups are centered around leaders, who are most often virtual personalities. These virtual personalities, the rulers of thoughts, actually act in the interests of non-public transnational monopolies. The level of consumption guaranteed by the state is carried out at the border of meeting basic and some additional needs. Satisfaction with non-natural products, and the ideology of responsible consumption of the green economy is aimed precisely at controlling resources. The multiplicity of forms of human self-identification, the multiplicity of forms of self-expression, a low level of social ties, the most stable of which is a family without reproductive functions. The transfer of consciousness into digital forms on an individual level, that is, everyone creates digital immortality for himself. Deterioration of health indicators, population decline, shortening of life expectancy, growth of integral scientific knowledge and its theologization. Knowledge begins to act as an object of worship. Art is a form of self-expression, not consumption. That is, all writers, but not readers. And finally, the golden 1 million, not 1 billion, because the reduction of the population with the installation of eudaimonism. Dear listeners, I do not want to say that this is my forecast in the field of social, future society. On the contrary, I want to show that in relation to forecasting the future development of society, no other approach than a scenario approach is suitable, because there are too many factors, too subjective assessments of these factors. It is too likely to incorrectly assume the consequences of the influence of one factor or another. That is, we cannot predict the future of society with certainty. But, perhaps, this is not a bad thing, but a good thing. Goodbye.